Well, picket lines, protest signs, and workers fighting for fair pay and better conditions. This year alone, we've seen major strikes across Canada and around the world, from rail workers to teachers, and now Canada Post workers are at the center of it all. Today on Blue Sky, we'll dig into the latest on the Canada Post strike, what's at stake for workers, and what it means for the rest of us. We'll also explore how the gig economy is changing the nature of labor and what protections, or lack of them, exist for modern workers. We'll hear from a Canada Post union representative, and we've got several labor experts joining us as well. If you're a worker or have thoughts on labor and strikes in Canada, or maybe you're a small business who's been impacted by the Canada Post strike, we'd love to hear from you today. You can give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Black Friday is just a day away, and many will be shopping online, hoping their packages arrive in no time. But there's at least one less option on the table when it comes to shipping. That's because Canada Post workers are 2 weeks into their strike action. Mediation talks between Canada Post and the union were suspended yesterday after negotiations broke down. Bram Enslin is the president of Saskatoon Local 824 of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and he joins me now in studio with the latest. Hi, Bram.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. What is the latest on negotiations?
So we recently learned what you just said, that the special mediator that was appointed to the parties has left, and saying that they're too far apart to have any sort of productive talks. Unfortunately, the two sides are too far apart. So that's bittersweet news. Obviously, it's bitter because it appears Canada Post is still not there to come to the table to bargain fairly and freely, unfortunately. But of course, some of the news that's come from the discussions that have been between the parties afterwards is that the Minister McKinnon, I believe, is not willing to, at least at this point, has indicated not willing to use back-to-work legislation or Section 107 of the Labour Code. So that's good. You know, that usually leads to arbitrated settlements, which for us has not moved us ahead like we were supposed to or should have over the past few years.
And we just got some news in that some Canada Post workers are being temporarily laid off as well. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's an extremely unfortunate development. It's actually something that's not allowed under the Labour Code, but it's something that it seems to be done to try to strong-arm an agreement from the members and to divide people from within. It is really unfortunate, but it is true. I can confirm there have been some terminations and some layoffs. Some of them have been full-time workers, and in our situation, some of them have been people that have required medications and things that are very important to their lives. Something else that they've cut off from workers as well. Anybody that's been on disability, they've taken that away from them as well. So we're dismayed to hear that. We would prefer to see them coming to the table, you know, and bargaining fairly instead of having these tactics employed.
And some of those folks are in Saskatchewan who have been laid off?
Yeah, we've had a couple of confirmations now.
Just as a reminder for people, what are some of the main issues that led to this strike in the first place? What are the key demands that you're fighting for?
I would just preface by saying I think it's sort of the vision of the post office in the future that's the biggest difference between the parties. Obviously, we're looking to have wages that can keep up with the cost of living, but that's not the main thing. It's better health and safety provisions. It's job security and security for members going forward. There's all sorts of provision that we're looking to avoid rollbacks from some of the benefits that we've gained in the past, which have been on the table. Unfortunately, they've always been. It seems like Canada Post is putting things on the table that are non-starters, and they know that are non-starters for the union.
Can you share some of the challenges that Canada Post workers face day to day, and how some of those challenges have evolved over the past few years?
Canada Post workers, obviously, if you're, especially if you're out on the streets, you're put in different precarious positions with, health and safety, different weather conditions. But there's probably too many to name. I mean, as a public service, you're encountering a lot of different health and safety conditions. But unfortunately, over time, we've sort of fallen under, in many places in Canada, fallen under the median cost of living. And so even with full-time work, Canada Post workers in some of, especially the bigger cities, are not able to keep up with the cost of living.
How nervous are people, especially with those layoffs, how nervous are people right now that that's a potential of happening to them as well?
Oh, it's an extreme worry. People have been reaching out asking if it's them. They're seeing different things on their, pay stubs that don't exist, of course, and just different, some people have received their ROEs in the mail and things. And some of those things do happen just automatically when you're on strike, but people are worried that means that they've been laid off because they've been hearing, and it's been confirmed that some of their workmates have been laid off. So it's working, it's scaring people, but we're trying to keep the resolve up and say, hey, this is not even something that they are allowed to do. It's something that they've been admonished for in the past for doing, and it's not something that they will be able to get away with once again.
So today is day 14, is that correct?
Yep, day 14.
How surprised are you that this has gone on as long as it has?
Oh, I'm surprised based on past, practice. I've been through a few stoppages. I haven't seen a full strike that's gone like this for this long in my time here. Usually it's been rotating strikes. There's often been, back to work legislation, and the last couple of times that's happened. So that's sort of what was expected. But, that's why I say bittersweet, because obviously it's not good to see the fact that they're negotiating in good faith, but it's also good to see that we haven't been legislated back or arbitrated prematurely.
You mentioned that higher wages aren't necessarily the main thing that you're asking for, but I do want to ask a little bit about that, because I think there might be some conceptions, some misconceptions
Sure.
that Canada Post workers are paid handsomely, if you will. So what kind of paycheck do Canada Post workers earn? I guess more so when they start. Obviously, people usually make far more when they've been there for a long time, but kind of what are wages like?
So there is a higher wage that you can make your way up to after 7 years, but one of the things that we had to accept in 2011, I believe it was in that round of negotiations, was a two-tiered system for new employees. New employees now started a much, like a 7-year program to get up to the top wage. Right now, it's just under or just about $30 an hour for the top wage, but you're starting at about a little bit over $20 an hour. So, for many years, and some will stay at a low wage as a temporary worker for quite some time. So it takes a whole lot longer now to get to that top wage. And, when it comes to the industry, comparably speaking, it's not one of the higher ones. It's actually lower than some in the industry. Other, companies have been, getting up to about $35 an hour. And there's been some comparisons done. And then when you go into Toronto and you go into Vancouver, these wages are not, again, there are people that are looking for assistance with food and with money. And, it's actually not keeping up with the cost of living. So it seems like, especially when people are used to seeing a number like that's very high, unfortunately with the cost of living increases, it's not as high as it seems anymore.
Now, Bram, this time of year is very important to businesses, small businesses. And earlier on the show this week, we heard from Jason Leo Bantle. He is a Saskatchewan nature photographer. And here is what he said about how his business is impacted by the strike.
Can everyone call Canada Post and please tell them to settle? Because, as a small business owner, it's impacting us huge. And the costs, our shipping packages are going up 30 to 40%, which means our profits for our shipping or for our product, our art is dwindling to zero. That's hard on a small business. So, and we're a Saskatoon-based business, 1011 Broadway Avenue, right on Broadway Street there. We're locals. So, any support has always helped. And, please Canada Post settle.
How much of your business, Jason, depends on sales from this time of year?
This time of year, our shipping is probably easily 60 to 70% of our business right now, Candace. Yeah. So people ordering for Christmas, for the Christmas season, just giving that gift of nature to their loved ones.
Again, that's Saskatchewan photographer Jason Leo Bantle. Bram, what would you say to people like Jason who are impacted by this strike?
Oh, we empathize completely, and we want to be out there working, delivering the packets, the parcels, and the mail that people expect. I was happy to hear that he mentioned, that Canada Post needs to come and settle. That's the focal point here. As much as you might hear otherwise, it's Canada Post that needs to come and settle to get this happening. Like I say, we do want to be out there delivering. We are taking no money during this time, when you're on strike. So unfortunately, that's it wouldn't be a great strategy in that regard. So it's something that we want to see done, and for the small business owners, we want to be there for you completely 100%. Take pride in that.
What about people who aren't getting things like checks and passports? What are some of their options right now?
I believe that there are other options that they're using to get those out, but we are also CUPW workers are also volunteering. I believe it's once a month. We just did it in November for some socioeconomic checks, so pension checks, child tax, other checks are actually still getting out. CUPW members are volunteering to do that, and there's been agreements like this in the past for many years to make sure that the people that need it the most are still getting their checks. So those will still get out.
There's also been concern from some parents and caregivers about letters to Santa, and I know some areas have kind of worked together to make that happen.
Yes.
So are there plans to do something similar here?
So yes, right now in Saskatoon, we're just getting all the necessary things together. As postal workers, we want to see that happen. We want to make sure that letters get to Santa and back to the people in the community. So in Saskatoon, we're looking to gather these on our picket lines. Right now, the main picket line is on 51st Street at the Canada Post plant. But for now, that's where we'll be able to collect them, and then also look for some other places that we might be able to bring it to the public as well in order to collect.
And again, that would be a volunteer operation.
Absolutely. 100% volunteer by Canadian Union of Postal Workers members.
Some people do feel frustrated by this strikes disruption. I am wondering, Brum, how you balance public support with taking strong action from your members.
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, the strong action comes mostly on a timeline, right? Like in the history of strikes and rotating strikes and everything, it doesn't always happen at this time, but our negotiations happened a year ago or in November of last year. Of course, Canada Post could have come to the table with offers any time during then, but a year later it was just too late, and that's when we took the strike vote. It took until that moment for them to even put an offer out. So I just want to sort of differentiate the time from when it's actually happening, because it's an unfortunate thing. We don't want to see Canadians ever be out or not receive the parcels and packets that they need, regardless of the time of year. But we are seeing the support from the people from the members of the public, from citizens that are saying that we need to see Canada Post come to the table and do that. So it's a tough balance, but this could be resolved very quickly if they do come to the table.
If the strike is resolved, what long-term changes do you hope to see for Canada Post workers and the postal system overall? There are people who are calling for Canada Post to no longer exist, so I guess what's your pitch for why it needs to?
Well, the public service is obviously we're fighting for this to remain a solid public service. The public service always acts as a bit of a social safety net. During COVID was a good example. The public service still runs, and sometimes where, private doesn't, right? And over time, that is the issue here. We're looking to see that Canada Post expand its services into more communities. Right now, we're in many communities right across the country, coast to coast to coast. But there are ways that the post office can expand those services, which would then in turn create better jobs and also more services for all community members, as the public service tends to do. Unfortunately, the investment that they made in 2021 seems to be to cut workers, to cut services and austerity measures over time. But that is a plan. That is an investment. This is why you're hearing about losses. Losses are coming, losses. But they're actually investments. They're actually strategic investments in trying to cut away the post office. And so that's the drastic difference. This is what they're trying to push through, where we're saying we'd actually like to see better protections, better services for all Canadians right across the country, into remote communities, Indigenous communities, and the ones that are typically underserved. So that's the big crux. There are, I'm sure people have heard, pushes for postal banking, but also to provide elder check-ins, but also rural internet and all sorts of things, electric vehicle charging stations, all sorts of things that the post office can be a hub for, since they're in every part of the community, and we can even create new ones. There are more post offices currently than there are Tim Hortons in the country. So why wouldn't you use that infrastructure? Unfortunately, we've been pushing for that since 2016, met a lot of opposition from Canada Post, because this is their plan. They are looking to cut overall into the future. So that's why you're hearing the narrative of losses. That's why you're hearing this narrative. And unfortunately, we want to change that and say, hey, look, we could be demanding better from our public service. We could be demanding better from our post office, and that relies on us. That relies on the public. That relies on government to demand this type of change. And so that's our plea, is to say that and that is one of our demands, is to see these expansions happen, to say, hey, look, let's demand a better public service here. It's always there for us when we need it.
Brum, are you feeling optimistic?
You know what? I am, and members are. This is a tough time of year. It's a tough time to be going through this, but time is marching along. Many members have not seen something like this. I'm optimistic by the fact that they're saying, we are not going to use legislation. We're not going to use arbitration. That's yet to be seen. Well, we'll see. They've said that before, but it seems like they're putting that in front of us here. So I am optimistic that Canada Post might be left with very few options as long as people understand that these are measures intended to strong arm. And if they do just come to the table like the minister is saying, we've got the minister on our side and saying, come to the table. Although, was saying that to both sides, but that's to say we need to negotiate this and not send it to legislation arbitration. That's an optimistic thing.
Brom, I know you're very busy. Your phone is buzzing constantly, which is fair enough. But so I really appreciate you coming in today.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me here.
That's Brom Enslin. He is the president of Saskatoon Local 824 of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We did get an email from a listener. Courtney is in Regina, and Courtney said, a reminder, strikes are supposed to be disruptive. They are supposed to hurt. Your letters and cards and gifts can wait until the people who do the hard labor in the hot sun and blizzards on ice, chased by dogs, are treated fairly by their employer for the work they do. This season is about caring for others in all kinds of ways, including ensuring good working conditions. Courtney goes on to write, let's also keep in mind that strikes often make things better for workers and workplaces. CUPW says that Canada Post's plan would, quote, create a second-class workforce with unpredictable hours, benefits, and pensions and fewer rights. If you wouldn't want to do the job, why should other people? And she goes on to say that in 1981, according to the Council of Canadians, Canadian postal workers won 17 weeks of paid maternity leave after a 42-day strike. That victory soon spread to workplaces across the country, popularizing the view that all workers should benefit from paid parental leave. A fair contract for unionized postal workers raises the bar for all working people. Courtney, thank you very much for your email. That came from Courtney in Regina. If you want to weigh in on today's conversation, we'd love to hear from you as well. You can email like Courtney did, bluesky@cbc.ca. Or you can give us a call, 1-800-716-2221. Well, joining us for the show today is Charles Smith. Charles teaches politics at St. Thomas More College at the U of S, and he's also an expert in labor issues. He's here to help us understand the wave of strikes we've been seeing over the past few years and what they mean for workers and the economy. Hi, Charles.
Hi, Candace.
What are you thinking about after hearing from Brom there?
So I was really impressed with that conversation. Brom clearly knows the issues and is working hard to try and bring these issues to the public. It's the post office is such a vital institution in Canadian society. It plays such an important role, not just in delivering mail, but in being sort of that support network to sort of build communities and have touch with across the country. It's been one of the most important sort of communicative institutions in Canadian history, and I think the workers that do that job face incredible, difficult conditions. I mean, we talk about not just the dangers of such a job when it comes to the walking and the driving, both in urban and rural settings, but trying to keep up with the changing pace of the Canadian economy and how we're delivering goods and services. So it seems to me like the issues that he's highlighting are so vital to a crown corporation that has for too long been, sort of, I think, trying to undermine some of these workers' rights and sort of, drive their competitiveness through lowering costs, labor costs. And I think that's a problem. And I think this strike is trying to highlight those concerns.
Are you surprised that the strike has lasted as long as it has?
So yes and no. I'm not surprised given the complexities of the issues and what's being asked. I am surprised that the federal government has not implemented some sort of back to work order, because that's what they've done in the past. So in 2011, as the guest was talking about, the Harper government intervened to end a mail dispute. In 2018, the Trudeau Liberals also intervened to end a dispute with postal workers. And in that case, the Trudeau Liberals argued that they had to send them back because of the Christmas shopping season. So I'm surprised that same rhetoric hasn't been used. I'm not sure why, other than probably the Liberals are concerned about getting such a piece of legislation passed through Parliament in the minority setting they have right now, or they're concerned about the optics of alienating sort of certain members of the working class that have been key electoral sort of drives in the last couple of years. So either way, I think the electoral pressures of the minority parliament are keeping the Liberals from acting with the heavy hand that they've used in the past.
I want to talk more about the political side of this in just a moment here, Charles, but I want to read this email from Sharon first. Sharon writes, strikes are a costly and fruitless interruption in this day and age. The unions have well past their days of use to protect workers. It is now time for the unions to work with, not against companies, to find better ways to keep the company in operation rather than greedily demanding more when the company, i.e. the post office, is in great debt. I do not have sympathy for strikers who follow the union dictates to everyone's detriment. Thanks so much for your email, Sharon. And again, you can get in touch at bluesky@cbc.ca like Sharon did. Charles Smith, I guess to Sharon's point, what ripple effects is this strike having on the broader economy and daily life of Canadians?
I mean, just to address the point directly, workers have very few levers to discuss the conditions of work, especially unionized ones, unless they're able to withdraw their labor. Collective bargaining means nothing if workers can't pull the trigger and withdraw their labor to put pressure on the employer. The employer also has the power to lock out workers. I mean, that's how our system works. But when you look at some of the benefits that workers have won over the years, cost of living allowances, pension benefits, health and safety regulations, all of that has come through sometimes long militant strikes. So to argue that workers no longer have the right to strike fundamentally misunderstands the power dynamics in a workplace. So, I mean, that's one. I mean, the second is that Canada Post is such a vital institution in these dynamics, and yet we still hear calls for saying that the post office is no longer important. Well, it can't be both, right? It can't be one, the post office is so unimportant that these workers should take concessions, but that the post office is so important and the business lobbies are saying they should be legislated back to work. Well, it can't be both of those things. It's either really important and thus workers deserve to be compensated fairly, or it's not important, but we're hearing it is. So I just think we have to sort of get our facts straight before we start sort of, saying that the sky is falling.
We have so much more to talk about, so stay with us, Charles. I'm Candice Lipsky. You are listening to Blue Sky on CBC Radio 1. That's 94.1 FM in Saskatoon, 102.5 FM in Regina, and 540 AM across the province. Now, this year alone, we have seen major strikes across the country, around the world. And if you're a unionized worker, or maybe you have thoughts on labor and strikes in Canada, we'd love to hear from you. You can give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or you can email bluesky@cbc.ca. I was just speaking with Charles Smith. He teaches politics at St. Thomas More College at the U of S. He's an expert in labor issues. Charles, what typically needs to happen for a strike like this Canada Post strike to reach a resolution?
Well, I mean, first off, I think they need to get back to the table. That would be that's where bargaining is done. And right now, the two sides are too far apart. I'm disappointed to hear that that Canada Post is engaging in layoffs during the middle of a dispute. I mean, technically, when you read the labor code and you read various labor board decisions, there's a duty of care that you can't change the conditions of work once bargaining has commenced, and it sounds like Canada Post is. Now, I can't make a judgment on that, but it does seem that the power dynamics that the employer is implementing speaks to some of the poison well that is being engaged in this bargaining round. So that's disappointing to hear. I think that suggests that the two sides not only are far apart, but there's a lot of bad blood between them. And it might mean a longer dispute than would have occurred otherwise. I mean, obviously, the corporation is in some serious financial constraints, although when you listen to some of the rhetoric from both sides, it's pretty clear there's been some investment decisions that went sour, which is hardly the workers' fault. The union has been promoting alternative forms of postal service delivery, including postal banking and other sort of services that could help in rural communities for well over a decade, and that's never been taken seriously. So the state that the Canada Post is in wasn't inevitable. I think there's been, obviously, as Adam King's piece, and I know you're going to talk to him later, talks about in the conversation, there's been some pretty dramatic changes in terms of competition with delivery that Canada Post has had to respond to. But one of the key issues in this dispute is trying to find ways for workers to continue to have well-paying jobs that all workers deserve and be a partner in this competitive environment.
Charles, stay with us. We are going to talk to Adam a little bit later on the show, but right now let's go to a caller. Chris is in Regina. Chris, what are your thoughts on this?
Good afternoon. Yeah, further to something that Charles just mentioned, I was thinking in terms of, I know that the post office has been losing a lot of money in recent years, and it's clear that there are some serious structural issues with the way it's operating at this time. I think, from what I've heard listening to various analysts, there's been, too much emphasis left on delivery of mail, which is a shrinking market, and that, there needs to be more of a shift to parcel delivery and whatever other services that would be more profitable for the organization. I have been a unionized worker in the past. I support unions. When I hear people saying that unions have outlived their usefulness, I think it's absolute nonsense. Most of those people probably have never worked in a union environment. But it seems that, some sort of structural changes are going to have to be made to the post office if it's going to survive. And I think it's a valuable institution. It deserves to survive. But I guess the question is in what shape or form. And perhaps maybe the government needs to take some major steps to change the upper management of the post office. If they are not open to, creative new ways of delivering the service or even tapping into new markets for the post office, and perhaps the answer is to change some of the key upper management positions. But I think, it seems I don't see a way out of this except that the structure of the post office is going to have to change. The existing structure, I don't think is tenable going forward.
Chris, I really appreciate your thoughts today. Thank you.
Thanks.
That was Chris in Regina, and you can give us a call like Chris did, 1-800-716-2221. Charles, you kind of touched on this earlier on, but are you surprised that the government hasn't stepped in at this point yet? And I guess what would it take for them to do so, in your opinion?
Well, a couple of things have happened at the federal level in the last sort of 5 years that suggest that the government it probably wants to step in, but for whatever reason is not. So two things. One is we know governments at the federal level and all levels actually will engage in back-to-work legislation, sort of taking away the right of these workers to strike by sending them back to work and usually imposing some sort of binding arbitration. Problem with that issue, well, there's many problems with that issues, but one of them is the underlying issues tend to never really get addressed when governments push workers back to work. What the federal governments have also been doing is using this kind of obscure part of the Canadian Labour Code that kind of imposes a form of binding arbitration that kind of acts as back-to-work legislation through the back door. And the minute the federal Minister of Labour has done that now in a couple of disputes in the ports. So it's surprising to me that they haven't engaged in this. I think in some ways it's good for the union because now that they can actually engage in the rights they have to bargain and strike. But clearly the pressure is mounting. So I think there's a lot of some political calculations going on in the background as well. Since the strike commenced, business lobbies have been arguing for back-to-work legislation. The CFIB has argued for back-to-work legislation since day one. They always do. They clearly don't sort of respect the right of workers to strike. They always see it as a detriment to their goals. That's fine, but that's certainly what they would argue for. So we're seeing that pressure. I'm surprised the federal government has not, given their past record. And I suspect there's a lot of political calculations going on, Candace.
Charles, stay with us. I do want to bring in another guest right now that you alluded to earlier. He has also been watching the Canada Post strike carefully and thinks it could be shedding light on challenges posed by the gig economy and unstable employment. Adam King is a professor in labor studies at the University of Manitoba, and he recently wrote an article in The Conversation on this topic. He joins us now. Hi, Adam.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. How do you think that this strike highlights larger issues within the gig economy and with precarious work?
Yeah, well, as Charles alluded to earlier, Canada Post is facing new competitive pressures really from the growth of private sector delivery. And in particular, the growth of these subcontracted, low-cost, low-wage firms that are really sort of providing a kind of gigified service in the parcel delivery sector. And that's really placed a lot of downward competitive pressure on Canada Post. And so that's why you're seeing, I think, Canada Post seeking these various concessions around the introduction of more part-time and contract work and really trying to sort of pare down some of the benefits that workers at Canada Post enjoy, such as pensions and other extended health benefits and those types of things. And so you're seeing Canada Post trying to impose some of those costs onto workers in order to compete with these low-wage competing firms.
How has the rise of private delivery services and gig workers impacted Canada Post and its workers? Like how bad has it actually been for them?
It's pretty significant. I mean, many of these companies are employing workers on in various precarious forms of employment. Often they misclassify them as independent contractors, in which case they're not entitled to basic minimum standards such as the minimum wage or caps on the maximum hours that they work in a week. That means that they don't have any entitlement to health and safety protections or workers' compensation if they're hurt on the job. So this is a very labor-intensive job and sector, parcel delivery. Injuries are not covered under the basic legislation that all employees enjoy. And so really across the board, these competitors, I mean, they're able to provide these very low-cost services, parcel delivery, because they're not paying all of these costs. They're not paying into employment insurance, into workers' compensation. And so really, I mean, I would characterize this as a form of unfair competition. And Canada Post and Canada Post workers are expected to compete with this. I mean, it's really not viable, not feasible. So something really needs to be done on the regulatory front to remove this form of unfair competition.
What role do you think the government should play or policy should play in protecting workers from the negative impacts of gig and precarious work?
Yeah, well, as I said, there needs to be more serious regulatory intervention. And governments, for the most part, have either been asleep at the wheel or facilitating this by choosing not to regulate. So essentially, we've seen governments in Ontario and British Columbia introduce partial reforms that kind of carve gig workers out of basic protections and give them a kind of separate suite of benefits that are subpar or not as protective as minimum employment standards. At the federal level, you have seen the Liberals introduce some promising things. So, for example, they've placed a reverse onus clause in the Canada Labour Code, which means that a federally regulated employer has to prove that their workers are independent contractors, not vice versa. So there's a presumption of employment. The challenge is that Canada Post is federally regulated, while most of these competitors are offering local delivery, so they're provincially regulated. So most of these small firms with which Canada Post is competing are operating under weaker standards, and it's much easier for these companies to be skirting the provincial laws, which is essentially what's happening.
This is really, really interesting. Adam, stay with us. Charles, you too. We're going to go to a caller right now, though. Jackie is in Regina. Hi, Jackie. What are your thoughts on this?
Hi. I was when I called in, I was thinking the person who took my call. I can 110% empathize with the workers on the picket line. I spent 7 months of my life on a picket line in Regina when the Co-op oil refinery, when we were locked out as employees. And it's tough. It's a tough go no matter what. You're losing. You feel like you're losing your job, regardless of what the outcome is going to be. You know you're for however long it takes. You losing your income and your livelihood, and just the basic things that you want in everyday life instead of walking up and down the sidewalk for 8 hours a day. And on the flip side, 20 plus years ago, I worked for Canada Post in a management / out of scope position. And so I can empathize on the company side because, times change. Listening to this whole conversation, you hear about the competition and the unfair competition. That was a great way to put it, of all the delivery services that are out there. Canada Post isn't what it used to be. There wasn't the online shopping 20 years ago, and it just seems every day some new courier is popping up to get your package to your doorstep one day quicker than the other person can. So it's a tough, sticky situation. I hope it's resolved soon for the hope of the workers and just to get people back to work. And I don't know. It's a tough one. And where I work, actually in Regina, I can literally see the picketers on the sidewalk every day outside my work window. So it's tough. It's a tough go, especially when it's minus 35 out during the days. So yeah.
Jackie? Did you say that you were in a labor dispute for 7 months?
Yeah, when the Co-op refinery locked out their workers, I was a unionized employee within the Co-op refinery at the time. I'd been there for 12 years. And we were locked out. We didn't go on strike. We were locked out for 7 months. And in the midst of that, COVID hit the world. And so then add on another year of unemployment because more than half of us got laid off while they were figuring out essentially what to do with the refinery and COVID restrictions and everything that went along with it. So wow. I was one of the people that I didn't have a job for over a year and a half with regular income.
Wow, Jackie, really interesting perspective from you. Thanks for calling today.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's good conversation to have. Thank you.
We're going to go to another caller right now. Mark is in Saskatoon. Hi, Mark.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. What are your thoughts?
There's been a lot of talk about Canada Post debt, and I don't think people realize that they're not quite in debt. It's more of a reinvestment, that they keep pushing this narrative that they're losing money. There's a quote from the CEO in 2022, and it goes, "Since 2021, we've already invested close to $1.5 billion to transform our businesses. Our 5-year plan to commit more than $4 billion to improve our network, increase capacity, and keep our people safe and green our operations." So that's close to $5 billion that they were going to reinvest back into the company. There's a brand new fleet of vehicles coming out called the C250s, which are an electric vehicle that is on a 250, like a Ford chassis, and they're worth $100,000 a piece. As well as you can also know they built a Albert Jackson plant in Scarborough, Ontario, which was $800 million. Now, these are all things that they classify as a loss, but they know that they're going to recoup that money. And the only reason that they keep pushing this narrative that they're losing money is because the contract is up for the workers. So really, it gets the public to dislike the workers, right? But through COVID, the ones that pushed it, right?
I hear you. Thanks so much for your call today.
Yeah, no problem. Have a good day.
That was Mark in Saskatoon. We also got an email from Anna who writes, "I would like to see places like Saskatchewan Health move to a digital format instead of relying on mail service. I hope this postal strike is the push they need to move into a digital world." Thanks for your email, Anna. And again, you can get in touch with us here on Blue Sky at bluesky@cbc.ca, or you can give us a call, 1-800-716-2221. I want to get back to our conversation about the gig economy because I think that this is a really interesting part of what's playing into this Canada Post strike. So, Adam, how do you think that the public's growing reliance on gig-based services affects their view of strikes like this one?
Yeah, I think certainly consumers have gotten used to the idea that they can sort of get things on demand. But just to place these comments, I think, in the context of the past couple of comments from listeners, we have a little bit of fuzziness here when it comes to our thinking about Canada Post, because on the one hand, we talk about it as though it's a business, which it technically is because it's a Crown corporation, but it's also a federal public service, and that places considerable limitations on some of the things that it can do. So the prices that it charges to deliver mail, for example, are regulated, and there's a mandate that they serve every community in Canada, no matter its location. Private delivery firms don't have such a mandate, and there are all kinds of people across the country, as much as we think mail might be obsolete, who depend on that mail. My own elderly parents, for example, are very concerned about where their mail is at the moment. They're not digital, and they're not going to go digital. So there are lots of communities around the country that still very much depend on Canada Post. And historically, this used to be a full-on federal public service and was moved off the government's books and transformed into a Crown corporation in order to impose business discipline onto the Postal Service. So we have to maybe rethink a little bit about Canada Post's place within the Canadian economy and what its function is. And I would suggest that involves thinking about it more as a public service. And so that really gets to the point about private delivery. Now, there may be a place for private delivery services, but the place is not to allow them to operate in an unregulated market, which undermines a vital public service like Canada Post. And I think that's the reframing that we need here.
We're going to go to one last caller right now. One last guest, rather. Larry Hubick has been working in the labor movement in this country for decades. He is the past president of Saskatchewan Federation of Labor, and he's now enjoying retirement. But he has taken some time today for a call from us. Larry, welcome back to Blue Sky.
Hi, Candace.
You've been listening into the show. I'm wondering, what is standing out to you most? What are you thinking about?
Well, obviously, when you get into a labor dispute, it's a difficult situation. But I agree with a lot of the commentary from your guests that these issues are best resolved at the bargaining table, and workers have a constitutional right under our Charter of Rights and Freedoms to, first of all, form unions, and then to engage in free collective bargaining, and third, if it's necessary, for them to take a job action to press their position at the bargaining table. And while it's inconvenient and uncomfortable and causes some concern, this is the only way that workers can put enough pressure on their employer so that their issues are satisfactorily resolved at the bargaining table in the exercise of those rights that are theirs under the Constitution.
Larry, stay with us for just a moment. We're going to go to a caller. Rhonda's in Regina. Hi, Rhonda.
Hello there. I would like to refer back to the previous gentleman that was talking about Canada Post as a public service. I was listening to a cross-country checkup program, and someone phoned in and was saying that Canada Post should be looked at as an essential service, and so therefore could benefit from subsidies, and then take the pressure off the profit side of Canada Post. And I agree too. I don't have any computer or anything like that. I'm not going digital. And then again, the aspect of in the north, everything there is received by mail. So those are the comments I want to pass on. And also, I'm not I'm kind of foggy on how much restructuring might need to happen with Canada Post, but definitely I really look to the aspect of it being an essential service so that it places it sort of in a different category, and then with a different, as I said, different emphasis regarding profits.
Rhonda, that's a really interesting point. Thanks so much for your call today.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
That was Rhonda in Regina. Larry, Charles, Adam, which of you wants to take maybe a stab at answering that? I think it's a really interesting idea of Canada Post being an essential service. So,
well, I could jump in first. It's Larry, if you don't mind. I agree and accept that the post office is a very important service, but it's not essential. And I don't think it would meet any definition of essential under any legal frameworks that exist in this country or elsewhere, because no one's life is at risk if the mail doesn't get delivered. People are being inconvenienced, but there are alternatives to the delivery model that's offered by Canada Post. Although not available in all locations, still there are alternatives. And so there's nothing magical about a designation as an essential service that brings with it a requirement to strip people of their rights under the Charter or under the Constitution. And so I think that while that may seem as a way that we could resolve this matter is by designating it an essential service, that simply wouldn't resolve the matter in any way, shape, or form, in my view.
Charles, it looks like you have something to add.
Well, it's worth pointing out, too, that we're not really talking about anything new with regards to how the Postal Service operates. So when you look historically, labor disputes in the Postal Service are as old as the Postal Service, and often those disputes have been waged over mechanization, right? The way mail's sorted, the way it's delivered, the way it's organized. So this goes back at least into the 1940s and into the 1960s when CUPW became a union under the Federal Public Service. And to further sort of Adam's point about the regulatory gap and the role of the state, I mean, to my knowledge, no country can exist or does exist in the current moment without a postal service. Certainly in the OECD, no country has a non-postal. It is, in that regards, an important service that no government is going to let fall off the wayside. It would be unprecedented. So that then asks the question: what's the correct regulatory reforms that we need to make the postal service work and to not have it, as Adam suggests, to be a race to the bottom for workers engaging in this vital, important public service. And I think that's the question that's not being answered by management: is what's going to make the Postal Service not be a race to the bottom for the workers performing this vital, I'll hesitate, Larry, not to use the word essential, but this vital work. And right now, the union has an answer, and the management's response has been to lay people off. And I think that's a real problem.
I want to take the last few minutes of the show to maybe broaden things out a little bit. And maybe, Larry, I'll start with you. Do you think that there's a change in the air? Do you think that younger generations are becoming more engaged with unions and labor activism, or do you think that there's a decline in interest? We got an email earlier from a listener who was kind of just done with the idea of unions. So I guess, Larry, what's the role of unions in today's world?
Well, I think that the role of unions hasn't changed. Whether people are engaging more or less than they were in the past, I think, is a question that we could take a look at. I don't subscribe to the philosophy that unions have been, outlived their usefulness. That song and dance has been going around for as long as I've been around, and I'm 70 years old. So I'm going to hear that. We're going to hear that for the next 100 years. But I think that actually, since there have been a couple of Supreme Court of Canada decisions, 3 of them to be exact, that have actually confirmed that the right to join a union, the right to engage in free collective bargaining, and the right to strike in this country are protected by our charter and constitutional, has given unions the ability to say to members or potential members that these aren't just desires that you have. These are rights that are guaranteed in the charter. And I think as a result of that, there is more engagement, or potentially more engagement, in unions by members who see this as more than simply agreed, but see this as being a fundamental right of being a citizen in a country like Canada. And so I think that there is more activity going on, and more people are taking an interest in what the union movement can offer them.
We don't have a ton of time left here, Adam, but I am wondering, with more workers in gig and freelance type jobs, how might the future of organized labor change?
Well, certainly. I mean, it's made it so that unions have to kind of rethink some of their old ways of organizing and representing workers, especially young people. And although the data on this is a little bit sparse in Canada, it's much better in the United States. It seems to be the case that young people support unions in much higher numbers than they are actually members of them. So there's a kind of representational gap when it comes to young people. And that's not surprising. Young people find themselves working in sectors that are underserved by unions for a number of reasons, but mostly because it's difficult to organize those workers in those sectors because they're engaging in forms of employment that are more precarious, in smaller workplaces, spread out, these various forms of employment that we've been talking about throughout this call. And so that's going to require that unions both rethink how they organize and engage with young people, but also lead us to think a little bit more about the regulatory framework under which we operate. Is there enough space underneath this legislative framework to actually allow these people to join unions in the numbers that I think that they desire to do so?
Charles, we have about a minute to wrap things up here, but what do you hope to see when it comes to this Canada Post strike?
I mean, a fair agreement for the workers that recognizes the long-term viability of the Postal Service, and one that reflects the value that workers provide to the corporation. I mean, at the end of the day, the face of the post office are the working people who do the job. And they deserve to be safe on the job, and they deserve to be paid a fair wage for that job. And that's what this dispute is about. It's about avoiding the race to the bottom and not sort of participating in it.
Charles, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
You bet. Nice to talk to you, Candace.
Adam, I appreciate your time as well.
Great to be with you.
And Larry, I'm sure we could have talked all day, but I appreciate your time today as well.
Thanks a lot.
Charles Smith teaches politics at St. Thomas More College at the U of S. He is also an expert in labor issues. We heard from Adam King. He is a professor in labor studies at the University of Manitoba. And Larry Kubik had been working in the labor movement in this country for decades. He was the past president of Saskatchewan Federation of Labor, and he is now enjoying retirement, but offered to come on the show for just a little bit today.